Alrighty guys, so today I'm going to teach you all about tempo, what it is, why we use it, and how to read it and then apply it to your training. So basically tempo is how we perform each rep during our training or during each movement, and by extension of that, how we perform each portion of that rep. And this helps us sort of reinforce our technique. It makes sure that we're lifting safely, as well as allows adequate time under tension for that program and sort of the desired effect. It standardizes each rep, which is important for our progressions. It makes those progressions a little bit more accurate. So when I say standardizes the rep, it keeps every rep the same throughout that set. We can use tempo as a progression method in some cases, where we have more control of a movement throughout it, that can act as a progression throughout it. And we also use tempo to sort of bias a movement to either improve the activation of a muscle or aid in the activation of a muscle, or as well to improve the performance of that lift. There may be certain portions of that lift that we want to really focus on, so we can use tempo to then bias them and improve it that way. Alrighty guys, now the way this tempo is going to be represented in your plan is with 4 numbers, each representing an action of that lift. So what you might see in your program is say 8 to 10 reps with a 2-2-1-0 tempo, or 10 to 12 reps with a 2-0-1-0 tempo. Now, each of those 4 numbers, as I said, is going to represent a different portion of the lift. Our first number in the sequence is going to represent the eccentric portion or an eccentric contraction in that lift. Now what that is simply when the muscle is lengthening. So if I look at a bicep curl, for example, as I control and lower that weight, I'm lengthening my bicep. That's an eccentric portion. If we look at, say, a chest press, for example, as I control it towards my body, the pec is lengthening. That's an eccentric contraction. So whenever we're talking eccentric, think the muscle lengthening. Now our second number is going to be the pause that follows the eccentric contraction. So if I'm coming down, the pause that follows the eccentric contraction is here in the extended position. Our third number is going to be a concentric contraction. Now concentric is the opposite to eccentric. So if eccentric is when I'm lengthening, concentric is when I'm shortening. So if we're looking at that bicep curl, concentric is as I curl the dumbbell or barbell or whatever I'm using up, I shorten the bicep. That's my concentric contraction. Or if we look at that chest press, as I was coming down, my pec was lengthening. As I push up, I'm shortening the pec. That's a concentric contraction. Our fourth number is the pause that follows the concentric contraction. So as I get to the top, my pec shortened, it's going to be the pause there. Or as I curl the bicep up and my bicep shortened, it's the pause in the shortened position there. Now each of those 4 numbers is the seconds you're going to take to perform that. So if we take our bicep curl as an example, typically we're going to start that with a concentric contraction. Now remember, concentric is when we shorten the muscle, and that was the third number in the 4 numbers. So we had we're going to run a 2-0-1-2 tempo for that. So 1 second, that's our third number for our concentric contraction. So we're going to take 1 second to curl up. We've got a 2 in the pause that follows the concentric contraction. So we're going to hold here for 2 seconds. 1, 2. Then we've got a 2 seconds in the eccentric portion of the movement. So that's when I'm lengthening my biceps. So now I'm going to take 2 seconds to come down, and I've got a 0 to follow the eccentric contraction. So there's going to be no pause at the bottom. I'm going straight into my next rep. So what it would look like is 1 second up, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's what that kind of tempo would be looking like. Now guys, it's important to remember with our tempo, it is 4 numbers that represent different actions in the lift. It is not 4 number sequence that you follow in order. So if I take our bicep curl and our chest press, for example, a bicep curl begins with a concentric contraction. So it begins with the third number, because that's what represents concentric, and the 4th number represents the pause after the concentric contraction. But a chest press, for example, if we're using a barbell, it's going to begin with an eccentric, so we begin with that first number there. So very important to remember, it's not a 4 number sequence that you follow in order. It is 4 numbers that represent different actions in that lift. First being eccentric when we lengthen the muscle, the second being the pause that follows the eccentric contraction, third number being our concentric contraction when we shorten a muscle, and our 4th number, the pause that follows that concentric contraction. Alrighty guys, so we'll go through a couple of examples now. So I'm going to start with a shoulder press. So this is going to be an example of something that begins with a concentric portion of the movement. So we're going to be looking at that third number first. So if we take a 2-0-1-0 tempo example, that means we've got a 2 second eccentric when I'm lengthening my delt here, and a 1 second concentric when I'm shortening the delt, which is going to be when I'm pushing up. Now I've got zeros in each of the pauses, so what that means is we're going to have continuous reps and constant time under tension. So what it's going to look like, so with my delt here, as I push up, I'm going to be shortening it, so that's going to be our concentric. As I come down, the delt lengthens, so it's going to be my eccentric. So if it's a 2-0-1-0, we're going to be looking at 1 second up. We're going to be going straight into a 2 second eccentric because I've got no pauses. 1 second up, 2 seconds down. Beautiful. All right, guys, so I'm in the hack squat here. So for a lot of our squatting movements, they're going to be movements that are going to start eccentric. So now I'm going to be looking at that first number to begin the movement. So if we take a 2-2-1-0 tempo, that means I've got a 2-second eccentric, I've got a 2-second pause following that eccentric contraction, a 1-second concentric, and no pause following that concentric. I'm going to be going straight into that rep. So if I'm in the hack squat here, I unrack it, get myself set. Now I'm going straight into a 2-second eccentric. 1, 2. I've got a pause following that eccentric for 1, 2, a 1-second concentric, and I've got no pauses following it, so I'm going straight into that 2-second eccentric again. 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So this is why it's important to really understand eccentric, lengthening a muscle. Concentric is when we shorten a muscle, because you might have the same movement, but depending on how it's performed may depend whether it begins concentric or eccentric. So if we take a barbell bench press and a dumbbell bench press, a barbell we're going to unrack, control it down, so that's going to begin eccentric, because as I come down, I'm lengthening the pec. But if I grab some dumbbells, typically I'm going to flick them up to my chest, and now I'm beginning concentric. So if we look at a barbell, we're going to be beginning with that first number, our eccentric. If we're looking at working with dumbbells for a concentric contraction, we're going to be looking at the third number. So let's take an example of just a 2-0-1-0 tempo. We'll go a nice basic one there. I'm going to get under my barbell. Because I'm beginning eccentric, pec lengthening, I'm coming under. It's going to be 1, 2, no pauses, straight into a 1-second contraction. 1, 2, 1-second contraction. Beautiful. But if I jump up and grab my dumbbells, if I flick them back here, now I'm in a position where I'm starting with a concentric contraction. So I'm going to be looking at that third number, which is a 1, and that should be performed the same way. 2 seconds down, no pause, 1 back up. So just an example, guys, as to why not to follow it in order, but to follow it in eccentric and concentric. Alrighty guys, so for a lot of our pulling movements where we're looking at rows, seated rows, dumbbell rows, bent over rows, or our pull downs, so our lat pull downs or our pull ups and things like that, when we're extending the arm away from the body, we're lengthening the lat. When we're pulling towards ourselves, we're going to be shortening the lat. So if we take a seated row, and like I said, these tempos will apply to all of those movements. If we take a 3-0-1-1, that means we've got a 3-second eccentric. So if I'm lengthening the lat, it's going to be 3 seconds I control out from the body. If I've got a 0, that means there's no pause following that eccentric contraction. I've got a 1-second concentric and a 1-second pause following that concentric. So I'm holding it at my body. So what it's going to look like is we begin with a concentric contraction. So I'm going 1 second in, a 1 second hold, and then 3 seconds out. I've got no pause following the eccentric. So 1 second in, 1 second hold, 1, 2, 3, out. Alrighty guys, so for our delts, when we're looking at like lateral raises and rear delt raises, some people can get a little bit confused. So as I come up with a lateral raise, that's when my delt is shortening. So as I bring my arm up, that's going to be the concentric portion. As I come down, my medial delt lengthens, that's going to be the eccentric. So if we take a lateral raise, for example, as I come up, shortening my delt, that's going to be the concentric. As I come down, I'm lengthening, that's going to be eccentric. Now if we jump in and do our rear delt, so they're sitting on the back there. If I come in, as I come back in this movement, I'm going to be shortening my rear delt, so that's going to be concentric. As I control it forward, my delt's going to lengthen, that's going to be eccentric. So as I come back, shortens, and as I come forward, lengthens. Alrighty guys, so we've gone through a bunch of examples there, but just going from head to toe, just a bit of a cheat sheet. When we've got our delts, as I bring it up, I'm shortening that medial delt. As I bring it back, I'm shortening the rear delt, or as I'm coming up like a front raise, I'm shortening. Or when we're pressing, I'm shortening that front delt. As I come down, I'm lengthening. As I come down from a lateral raise, I'm lengthening. As I come forward with a rear delt, I'm lengthening. So all of those are going to be eccentric. The first ones I mentioned there are going to be concentric. For our chest, as we bring it towards ourselves, the pec lengthens. That's our eccentric. As we push away, that's when it shortens. It's going to be concentric. For our lats, as we reach away, so if we're doing rows, as we reach out in front, or pull downs, if we're going up, this is when we lengthen the lat. This is going to be eccentric. As I pull down towards myself, or when I'm rowing towards myself, we're shortening the lat. That's going to be concentric. If we look at the lower body with our quads, if I come down into a squat, I'm going to be lengthening my quads. That's eccentric. As I come up, we're shortening them. that's concentric. If I'm looking at my hamstrings, if I curl my knee, my leg upwards, I'm shortening the hamstring, concentric. As I extend, I'm lengthening it. Or if we're looking at hinges, as I go back, I'm lengthening both the glute and the hamstring. As I come up, I'm shortening the glute and the hamstring. So as I shorten them, that's concentric. As I'm going down and lengthening, that's our eccentric. For our calves, very simply, as we come up, we shorten the calf. As we come down, we lengthen it. For our biceps, I curl up and shorten it. I come down and lengthen it. Triceps, the opposite. As I extend it out, I'm shortening the tricep. As I come up, I'm lengthening it. Alrighty guys, so we've gone through a couple of examples now of just push, pull, hinges, squats, all of it, so you can kind of see how we use that tempo throughout all of our training. But just to recap on a couple of things, remember our first number in the sequence is our eccentric contraction, which is when we lengthen that muscle. Our second number is the pause that's going to follow that eccentric contraction. Our third number is the concentric contraction. This is when we're shortening a muscle. And our fourth number is the pause that follows the concentric contraction. Each of those numbers represents the seconds you're going to take at those actions. So if we've got a 2 in the eccentrics, that's 2-second eccentric. So 2 seconds to lengthen that muscle. Important to remember, it's not in order. Not every movement begins eccentric, not every movement begins concentric. We need to look at each number and it represents the action of that movement. We need to not follow it in order. So it's not something to follow from number 1 through 4. Sometimes if it's beginning with a concentric, you'll start with number 3. Lastly, guys, if you're ever unsure or you just need a little bit more clarification, just ask your coach.